आत्मनिर्भर भारत से विकसित भारत के निर्माण को और सशक्त कर रहे हैं.
Imagine if Russian oil doesn't get picked up. What would happen? The overall global oil markets would tighten.
थर्मल पावर प्लांट हो, गंगा नदी पर बन रहे अनेकों बड़े पुल हो, नेचुरल गैस का नेटवर्क हो, गांव-गांव तक उज्ज्वला की गैस पहुंचाने का नेटवर्क हो, ये सब रोजगार की गारंटी होते हैं, रोजगार की गारंटी.
I can assure you that when you press that button after June 4th, there will be strong acceleration. We will be well on our way, quickly on our way. For 100 days, there will be a lot that we will journey.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi has made India's foreign policy a key talking point during the Bharatiya Janata Party's election campaign. When Modi was first sworn in as the Prime Minister in 2014, he had invited leaders from all neighbouring countries. During the just concluded Lok Sabha polls campaign, he and his cabinet colleagues had emphasized a vision of a Viksit Bharat, which they said has become stronger in their term.
This transformation of India makes us a more effective and credible partner. Whether it is the ease of doing business, infrastructure development, ease of living, digital delivery, a startup and innovation culture, or shaping the international agenda, India is clearly a very different country today. This is important.
However, the next government will have numerous foreign policy challenges to face, from ties with India's neighbouring countries such as Maldives, Sri Lanka, Nepal and Bangladesh, as China continues to build its influence in the region, to the fallout of the allegations made by the US, Canada and Australia of carrying out intelligence activities and alleged assassinations and murder plots on their soil. Hello and welcome to The Print. My name is Keshav Padmanabhan, and over the next few minutes, I will try to break down the last decade of India's foreign policy and with it the challenges for the incoming government.
He's more comfortable with a grouping that does a lot of diplomatic work, that does a lot of diplomatic cooperation, that does a lot of non-traditional security, and that provides sort of the baseline requirements for India's security. So it's one thing to conduct operations against terrorist groups and individuals residing in Pakistan, but it's an entirely different thing, obviously, if those kinds of actions are undertaken in countries with which we hope to have closer ties.
After the elections of 2014, China has expected that, since this is an election result and a lot of youths have voted for the present dispensation, China believed that the government who is popular and a solution to the boundary issue is a political one. They expected a lot from the present dispensation of 2014 and 15.
So therefore, I think the change that Modi government brought to it was to discard the past ideological baggage, look at them from fresh eyes, that you could pragmatically engage with them.
The last 10 years, right, and of course that's a long period, but I can for sure say that the semantics of our bilateral engagement, has changed.
Manmohan Singh government actually institutionalized India-Africa partnership with a India-Africa Forum Summit, IFS. So far we have three, one in 2008, 2011 and 2015. The last one was also in New Delhi, and over more than 40 African presidents were present in India. So it was a big event. We really thought that in Africa has became a priority issues for priority in foreign policy for India.
China, the world's second largest economy and India's largest trading partner in goods, has been a large part of New Delhi's strategic thinking in the last few years. Prime Minister Modi, while he was Chief Minister, visited the country 5 times and spoke fondly of its manufacturing prowess. This led to a lot of optimism during the early years of his tenure as Prime Minister, but that has since devolved into serious tensions after the incidents at Doklam and the Galwan clashes in 2020.
After the elections of 2014, China had expected that, since this is an election result and a lot of youth have voted for the present dispensation, China believed that the government who is popular and a solution to the boundary issue is a political one. They expected a lot from the present dispensation of 2014 and 15, which resulted into a number of informal meetings, a number of discussions happening at the ministerial level and exchanges taking place. But you would see that after 2015-16, the China started maybe losing patience vis-a-vis the expectations they had from the Indian side, and that resulting into kind of a strain between the India-China relationship. And the transition from 14 to 2017 Doklam and moving forward to Galwan shows that how China moved away from trusting India's ability and political establishment's ability to put solutions or maybe points to be negotiated bilaterally, and as a result of it, China moved away. Because I would say that from 2014 onward, until Doklam happened, the Indian stand towards boundary and engagement were quite consistent. India expected that will be a new kind of median which will help not resolve at least, but to progress on the boundary questions. But the Chinese lost the patience, and I think that's the reason China started disbelieving how India would behave in the regional affairs, and that resulted into escalating India-China relationship.
While India-China ties soured, Beijing continued its policy of attempting to influence India's neighbors from Maldives to Nepal. And this posed a challenge to India's ties in the region.
The difficulty now is that historically there hasn't been, the neighborhood has had concerns about India, but they haven't had any other external power that could support them against India. And now they do. So China has become strong enough to be able to provide that support against India if they want that. And of course, we have seen that most clearly in Maldives, in a different sense in Pakistan. Of course, that's a longer standing problem, but also in Bangladesh, in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, and so on, and Nepal, obviously. Of the smaller neighbors, it's a good time because they can play India off against China and get the best from both. Even though historically our diplomacy in the region has not been great, but over the last 10 years, last 15 years or so, our game has become better in the sense that I think there is a realization that there is no point crying about it, that we have to play that game and we have to compete. And so our deliveries and our responses to the neighborhood has been faster, more prompt, more nimble. And so I think that, but it is not a problem that is going to go away as long as China remains as powerful as it is and or becomes more powerful. China will always have an interest in turning, in sort of playing in India's neighborhood.
From 2014 onwards, when India was engaging in having informal meetings with China, China was displacing India in South Asian subcontinent, whether that is trade, whether that is material supplies with regard to defense and military, whether that is Bangladesh, Maldives, or Pakistan is concerned. And when the China saw that there is more benefit of continuing material and strategic engagements with India's adversaries when something is not coming out of India, the stand became more evident in Galwan, and China started pushing its cart much more aggressively than earlier times.
Pakistan, India's western neighbor, however, has historically been considered as an adversary. Its long-standing ties with China and larger economic power in the neighborhood aided in its opposition to India over the last few decades. However, its own internal issues, from its economic crisis to political crisis, has led to a shift to its relationship with India.
So Pakistan has been able to consistently attempt to counter India, attempt to balance India. And so they have for the last 6-7 decades now done that, and for much of that time they have had China support in doing that. And that's kind of one of the most solid security partnerships in the world. I mean, it's most consistent, one of the most consistent security partnerships in the world. And so they have cooperated significantly, including in the nuclear realm in the 1980s and 1990s, which is something that no other security partnership has had. Not even the British and the American one have had that level of cooperation. So that is something different, but that will partly depend, of course, on the level of Pakistan's own internal capacities. And what we are seeing now is that Pakistan has become much weaker, much less capable of balancing and countering India. And so there's nothing that China can do about that. That's an internal Pakistani problem. And so, but Pakistan can't play the same game that India's smaller neighbors can play.
The mistrust between China and India also increased as New Delhi's ties evolved with the European Union and the United States of America.
Quite frankly speaking, India has been dealing with this challenge of not being called as, Western ally, and at the same time, India wanted to keep its position neutral or maybe very realistic. That has been India's position. But over the period of time, for say about last 10 years, if you're talking from 2014 to 2024, Beijing misread this thing, and Beijing thought that we are going to become more sort of Western ally.
The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or the Quad, is a partnership between India, Japan, Australia, and the US that in the last few years has become one of the main pillars of New Delhi's security dialogue with Washington, D.C. It is also considered a part of India's attempt to balance Chinese interests in the Indo-Pacific.
India was reluctant even to call it the Quad, because if you look at statements from the MEA and so on, from 2017 onwards, you would simply find references to the India, US, Australia, Japan grouping, not about the Quad. And then after 2020, we started actually calling it the Quad. And of course, cooperation within the Quad has tremendously increased over the last 5-6 years or so, especially in the context of the pandemic and so on. But more recently, of course, the United States and as well as India's other partners, Australia and Japan, have been setting up their own trilateral and other quadrilateral and other formats, which are much more security oriented. And so I think in that respect, there has been some concern that the Quad may not be as important for the others.
The Quad's focus, however, is on non-traditional security cooperation, and not so much as a traditional military alliance.
Partly a reflection, I think, of India's own requirements, because India has been somewhat uncomfortable with making the Quad primarily a security-oriented grouping, even though there are military exercises and other military-level cooperation and intelligence cooperation associated with the Quad. But India would prefer that it do more of non-traditional security, things like vaccines or cyber security, things of that kind. I mean, not really hardcore security like military cooperation, like in a military alliance.
Ties between India and its Quad partners, specifically the US and Australia, have faced some headwinds after allegations of New Delhi's intelligence activities in involvement in murder plots and the assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar have come to fore in the last few months.
I think it is potentially a risky move in the sense that it is not just US and Canada. There have also been accusations from other countries, including Australia. So there are, these are countries that are partners, security partners, and so these kinds of accusations and actions, if those accusations happen to be true, I think, considering all the sort of the various different countries that are making these accusations, countries that really have no interest in making those accusations. I think the US would rather wishes that it rather would go away. I mean, they don't want to deal with this kind of issue. So I think considering those factors, I tend to suspect that there might be something to these accusations. But I think from India's own perspective, this is potentially a very risky move. So it's one thing to conduct operations against terrorist groups and individuals residing in Pakistan, but it's an entirely different thing, obviously, if those kinds of actions are undertaken in countries with which we hope to have closer ties. No country conducts assassinations on American soil, for example, not even the Israelis, who have conducted such operations in Europe, for example. Negative consequences in terms of, reportedly negative consequences in terms of intelligence cooperation between India and the United States. And intelligence cooperation is one of the most important aspects of the India-US security relationship.
There are challenges with New Delhi's traditional ally, Moscow. India-Russia ties have weathered numerous eras of global politics: the Cold War, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the global war on terrorism, and now Russia's war with Ukraine. However, as a result of its current actions and the no-limits partnership with China, this poses a challenge to India's geostrategic interests.
But what we are more concerned about is that regardless of the outcome of this war, Russia is going to get pushed further with China, because the sanctions are not going to go anywhere. And if you look at how this no-limit friendship between Russia and China has deepened in the last 2 years alone, it tells you that this is a pretty irreversible trend. You also see that in the last 5 years, though India has been, the original customer for Russian weapons, but in TIV indicator values, which is the trend indicator values, in those values, actually China has received more weapons deliveries from Russia as well. So basically, the thing is that for Russia, China is becoming very, very indispensable. And that is going to affect our calculus with Russia, because of course it is discomforting for us. We have been using Russia to balance our larger outreach, in the continental Eurasia, etc. But I think we should be mindful of all these changes.
The war in Ukraine has also had an impact on how the European Union views its role in the world. It has increasingly shifted from a humanitarian aid provider to positioning itself as a security partner for countries, a pivot that India supports.
Last 10 years, right? And of course that's a long period, but I can for sure say that the semantics of our bilateral engagement, has changed, because earlier European Union or Europe, if you just, with an exception of France, of course, because France, as you know, has been our very important strategic partner, and the defense cooperation goes back, many, many decades. So setting France aside, you're talking about Europe. I think earlier, when I say the semantics, the language was more to do with the, the developmental projects, the European Investment Bank, all the metro, things that they have here in India, and all that. And then the trade, connectivity. So we were constantly referring to those kind of things, because European Union was always perceived as a major geo-economic player. So when they pivoted to Indo-Pacific, that was also done for the reasons of economic security than anything else. But that semantic has changed after the war in Ukraine particularly, where you see that there is a discernible shift in the European transformative agenda, that earlier it was all about clean energy and green energy, etc. But now it's more about asserting their space in the strategic, space in the world, which is that they want to emerge as a security provider, as a security actor. And this particular change has also changed how we have been talking to the European Union.
This has opened an opportunity for India to become an arms supplier to Europe, Armenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina. While also importing weapons from European countries, it may otherwise have found it difficult to do so.
If you see that we have been expanding our footprint, our diplomatic footprint has risen. So whether it's the Central European countries, our engagement with Poland, our engagement with Spain, our engagement with Greece, a very important partner out there, or our engagement with the Balkans, right? I mean, our ties with Bosnia-Herzegovina. So these kind of relationships did not really exist earlier. Also, our, how we have stepped up our presence in Armenia, the Caucasus, by supplying Armenia with all these weapons, and as well as the Baltics, where we have these very, significant ties now with Lithuania. So what I want to say is that if you look at Europe, there are these star performers, starting from France, where of course we have deepened our defense relationship. There is also so much convergence in the Indo-Pacific, very importantly. Germany has emerged. Germany and Spain are basically two countries that have emerged as these two contenders competing for our largest strategic partnership model program of the conventional submarines.
The government, in September 2023, signed the Memorandum of Understanding for the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, also called as IMEC, to signal its intention to open up new routes for trade to Europe. The route goes through West Asia, where the Israel-Gaza conflict is still ongoing, and Iran, India's partner in the region, has faced a political shock with the death of its president, Ibrahim Raisi.
And I think IMEC too is a recognition that actually Arabia is next door. And Arabia is the bridge to Mediterranean and to Europe. Because historically, again, our traditional ideological orientation meant we saw in the North-South terms, Europe versus, Asia, all these were some kind of contradictory categories. But the fact, I think what IMEC does is, look, we can actually connect with the Mediterranean and develop trade routes with Europe, which is actually one of our biggest trading partners.
Ties with West Asia have evolved, given the issues the regimes in the region has faced in the last decade, especially the security threat. This has aided India's approach to the region in the last decade.
The Middle East was always important for India, but I think in the past there was a certain defensiveness with which we engaged them. There was a sense that many of them, not all of them, were Islamic. Therefore, the fear that they're closer to Pakistan than to us, or framing the issues of the Middle East as West versus the Middle East, and Israel versus the Arabs. So I think we had this framing of a certain set of contradictions which we saw were permanent. And the policy right from the 1950s was largely adapted to, addressing those contradictions. But the reality on the ground was changing very, very fast. In a way, for example, many of the countries in the Middle East, they themselves were facing threat from Islamist extremism. Say, for example, after the Arab Spring, the fear in some Arab countries that actually the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamic radicals were going to overthrow the existing order. So whatever they might have done before, so for them, radical Islam was a problem even bigger for the Middle East, for many of the regimes in the Middle East, except those who were actually sponsoring them. So for them, there was a need to promote moderation, limit extremism, especially in the Gulf, particularly for Saudi Arabia, which is really the heart of the Gulf and the Middle East.
The Indian government has acted to an extent to firm up its opportunities in the region by creating institutional frameworks for further dialogue amongst its partners such as Israel and the UAE through fora such as the I2U2.
Look, I think I think these conflicts will come to an end or will be managed at some point. I think what IMEC and I2U2 did was really give an institutional form for a pragmatic engagement with the region. After all, I2U2 has, Israel, United States, and the UAE are three countries we tried to keep away from. For whole of post-independence era, we said, look, we don't want to do anything with Americans, we don't want to do anything with the Israelis, we don't want to do anything with the Gulf Arabs, because they were all conservative. To one of actually working with them to do things, whether I2U2 progresses fast or not, but the fact UAE has reason to invest in agricultural technology in India. UAE has the significant amount of money. Israel has the technology to do kind of things that we did not do before.
Coming to another region for Indian diplomacy, Africa. Ties have been uneven at best. The Manmohan Singh government had instituted a framework for high-level dialogue the India-Africa Forum Summit, and held 2 during his tenure in 2008 and 2011. In 2015, the Indian government hosted the 3rd India-Africa Forum Summit, but since then, none have been held. The Print reported that there are plans for another summit this year after a 9-year gap.
India's Africa policy, it started with Jawaharlal Nehru with this Bandung conference, Afro-Asian unity, but then unfortunately died with Jawaharlal Nehru. After that, for several decades, because of India's economic growth and other challenges, India's Africa policy was quite dormant. But then it got reinvigorated in 2008 when Manmohan Singh government actually institutionalized India-Africa partnership with a India-Africa Forum Summit, IFS. So far, we have 3, one in 2008, 2011 and 2015. The last one was also in New Delhi, and over more than 40 African presidents were present in India. So it was a big event. We really thought that in Africa has became a priority issues for in foreign policy for India. But then nothing happens in 2015 to 2024. Even though the start of Modi government was a big announcement, Africa as a priority, Africa is in the center of India's foreign policy, I think somehow the priority has got little bit down.
In 2018, Prime Minister Modi, during a visit to Uganda, had outlined 10 principles for the India-Africa ties. New embassies have been announced and opened across the continent. The efforts, however, have not been followed up as closely, and this poses a challenge to India's future ties with African countries.
What Prime Minister Modi's distinction was the amount of importance he gave to Africa. In his first 5 years, he visited Africa probably 3 times. He visited more than 9 countries. He gave a lecture in the Ugandan parliament. That was the first time. And during that speech, he also enunciated India's Africa policy in 10 short paras. But where my regret is that there is lack of follow-up actions of those points.
Your Excellency, President Yoweri Museveni, Your Excellency, the Vice President, Right Honorable Rebecca Kadaga, Speaker of the Ugandan Parliament, Honorable Ministers, Honorable Members of the Parliament, Excellencies, brothers and sisters, Namaskar. Bala Musija.
African, it's the most youthful continent. So the by 2050, 1 out of 4 people will be from Africa. We need to use this. And then Africa is also the source of a lot of critical minerals like lithium, uranium. The 4th industrial revolution will come using those minerals and critical minerals, and if India does not claim its stake, I mean, it does not have to be like a scramble for Africa. It has to be a joint growth. How India can use its expertise to help Africa grow. These are the challenge. These are the policy that we need to be clear in among ourselves and then reach out to Africa.
This is all from me today. Thank you for tuning in to The Print. Subscribe below for more such news and analysis.